You're listening to Distraction Therapy with Rob Watson. Conversations about how we find meaning in our lives and what it's like to be part of a meta-modern world.
I'm very glad to say that we're joined by Daniel Gortz.
Hey David, good to see you again.
Yeah, you too. This is going to be a conversation about metamodernism and the particular form of metamodernism that Daniel and Hansi Freinacht, Daniel's alter ego, is known for. I've got a few questions, so Daniel and I will talk for about 45 minutes or so before we'll shift to the Q&A portion. Daniel, welcome. I'd like to ask, just so we can get it out of the way, you are both Daniel Gortz and Hansi Freinacht?
Well, so I'm Daniel Gortz. Hansi Freinacht lives in the Alps, and he also lives in the virtual realm, and he resides at a very specific crossroads there, at the crossroads of fact and fiction. And fact and fiction is also where the imagination meets the political, and where really interesting things can happen. If you imagine something and then you work really hard at it, sometimes it becomes real.
The term metamodern obviously kind of points to the idea that there are distinct phases: modernism, postmodernism, which is essentially kind of deconstructive, and then metamodernism is one of the words that seems to be applied to this place beyond, that is some kind of resolution of the tension between modernism and postmodernism. And there's obviously lots of other intellectual communities or people talking about different frames that maybe point to the same thing or a similar kind of resolution. And I'd love to start by just framing your work within that, because I think a lot of people on the call will be aware of the sense-making web, for example, Game B, the integral communities. What relationship does metamodernism and your work specifically have to that? How would you position it?
So roughly speaking, metamodernism is closest of those things to integral theory, from which it sprang to a large extent. So some years back, I was very interested in integral theory. I started applying it also in academia. You couldn't really use it explicitly because people would be suspicious of this bald, crazy Ken Wilber type and talk about spirituality and stuff like that. But you just apply the maps just spontaneously or within any topic, and it was kind of having a cheat code. It's like, wow. You can stump the professors if you want, and you can go and say interesting things in any topic, because it's like we're in a Renaissance time, as I think our mutual friend and acquaintance Andrew Sweeney has written about. And there's like, for those who can sense that what's coming next, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. You can kind of run around and pick it. Also in the realm of theory, and also in the realm of then inventing stuff in society. So I got really interested in that while being a sociologist and doing police research and more mainstream stuff like that. And I wanted to apply integralism to the political realm in progressive countries like Sweden. It looked in those theories as the, wait a minute, what happens if you gather all of these yellow people, so to speak, and turquoise people, or like those that resonate with integralism and have certain traits, developmental traits, and so on. And it didn't quite work out. It was very difficult to make it political, and it just also attracted particularly perhaps folks who were very interested in the spiritual part of it. There was a longing for this kind of civic conversation that would include spiritual and existential aspects of life. So the organization that I started to get with some friends, one of them was Emil, who is also part of Metamodernism, together with whom I later wrote the books, we noticed through that work that it didn't become political, it just became this civil society thing. And we also noticed that integral theory wasn't that good at it. And it also had, which isn't so strange, it's not a social theory, it's not a political theory. It wasn't designed to do that, really. And it also had too many loopholes in terms of a little bit too much magical thinking here and there, and a little bit too much woo-woo, a little bit too soft edges, and the aesthetics weren't quite appealing to most people, and particularly not the cultural elites. I mean, it was kind of new agey and kind of had this hysterical, shiny undertone, like they would shake you almost, like, come on, wake up, we're doing this awesome thing, it's gonna be super duper awesome, we're gonna be superhuman.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you for speaking kindly of my two latest book, The Nordic Secret. I should mention that I've written that one together with my friend and colleague Lena Andersen, Danish philosopher and author. And then I should also mention that actually the first book I wrote, which I think is becoming more and more relevant, actually was coming out of the banking world. I've been an investment banker for many years, and before that I was in mathematics and physics, and using then my mathematical and skills and modeling in investment banking. So when I left investment banking a bit more than 10 years ago and set up my own foundation in Stockholm, the Oak Island Foundation, Ekfärret. The first book I wrote is called The Market Myth. And it's really my experience from the inside in the market as an investment banker for more than 20 years, thinking about the strength of the market, because of course the market is an incredibly strong human invention. But we should remember that it is a human invention. It's not a natural phenomenon. But also, we have, I think, and I argue in that book, put a little bit too much faith in the market. And the market has sort of become a guiding star for all human activities in a way that the market is not just suitable to accomplish. So as good as the market is in many ways, the market cannot help us with a number of things. And I think that is, at least here in Scandinavia, becoming very evident now in the COVID crisis, where we in Scandinavia have sort of privatized most aspects of healthcare and medicine and all of that. And it comes a little bit as a surprise now to the society that the market has not really been able to provide those buffers and been able to be long-term enough to help us in this crisis. So that was the first book I wrote. And then you mentioned the market myth, you mentioned the Nordic Secret, which is about which is about the fact that we in the Nordic countries actually had very visionary politicians and intellectuals 100 to 150 years ago who really saw the connection between personal inner development and our ability to make meaning, I would say, and societal change. Right. And how this insight really helped to lift all the Nordic countries from being the poorest, non-democratic agrarian countries 150 years ago to become, just a few generations later, the happiest, richest, most stable democracies in the world. And that was really this focus on inner development. So making a long story short there, what we did back then was that we started actually a huge number of what I sometimes jokingly call retreat centers all over Scandinavia. And we later on made it possible for young adults in their 20s to spend 6 months at one of these centers with the expressed aim of developing your inner capacities to be able to act as what we today might call conscious co-creators in the creation of modernity and democracy. So that's quite an amazing story and not that well known. Right.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, I think, because it's quite perceptive and also quite interesting that Robin is a philosopher and I have a background in philosophy, but I would call myself, I guess, a media scholar first and foremost these days, maybe cultural theorist / media scholar, but that indeed our initial observations were concerned primarily with visual arts. And by that, I mean gallery arts, museum arts. So stuff that we were seeing in the shows that we were visiting, and also the talks and debates around those shows. So this was very much linked to an art form that was of interest to us, but wasn't necessarily our main area of expertise at all. Perhaps this also made it more exciting. I think there is, however, another reason for that hierarchy or the temporal organization where the arts came first, which is that a painting is quite easy to make and quite cheap to make, whereas a book might take longer, a film costs tons of money, a TV show even more, and then also has all kinds of pilot audiences that will tell executives whether the TV show works or not. And architecture, of course, especially, is this very sluggish, this very slow artistic form, this applied artistic form, because it needs money, but it also needs space, and it needs all kinds of bureaucratic processes to work. So I think architecture is always late. So I think there is also a particular reason for that, that distinct organization of when stuff perhaps comes out or is obvious or is easily discernible. As for architecture, because this is what you asked for, I mean, I was in Venice a while back to see the biennial, where the main question was, how will we live together? Which I think in and of itself is already a question that is very different from which influences do we use, or what is the most cost effective, et cetera, right? There's all kinds of questions we could ask of architects, but how will we live together? And then the emphasis, I guess, both on the we and the together seems to me in itself to be a question quite pertinent to the metamodern moment, where we ask for ways in which we, regardless of where we're from or how we feel or what we associate with, can find ways, can build, can use spaces to come together somehow, right? And this we then includes not just humans, but also, this was very present at the biennial, which I, by the way, didn't think was a success, but in any case, was very present there, also other species, right? So also the non-human, the post-human, and so on and so forth. And I think this was quite interesting, that there is this question pertaining to a future, to a moment that is not of the here and the now. And if I think back of the modernist architecture, which we think about brutalism, we think about minimalism, we think about less is more, right? We think about structures that are purely there for the functionality of the living, right? In the first place. Of course, the whole aesthetic that comes with it, you could say this or that about, but the instance is about functionalism. It's about, this is what you need to live. And then postmodernism does the opposite. It begins to sort of move, begins to look like Las Vegas. It takes everything apart and puts it together, and you get all those weird fake simulacral palaces and eclectic forms. And it's very much about all kinds of formalism, all kinds of flourishes and things like that. So it's a sort of a playful architecture. So you have a very functional architecture, brutalism I think comes to mind here most, and you've got a very playful architecture. And then I would say the architecture that we've seen occurring for the last 20 years or so, not all together maybe, but in fits and stages, is what we in the initial article called either a sort of a green architecture or a romantic architecture, and what we might also call, as Bjarke Ingels, a very important architect in this recent movement, calls hedonistic sustainability, or yes is more, is an architecture that combines, you might say, the functionalism, the attention to detail for how we might build a house that is functional for living in, with those postmodern flourishes, but, and this is important, with two kinds of additions. The first is that it thinks about the environment as a whole, so that the house is more than a house, the skyscraper is more than a skyscraper, the school is more than a school. It has to be part, both aesthetically, but also ecologically, of a wider landscape. It has to function not just for us living in it, but it has to function for everything surrounding it as well, right? And that everything might be the smaller houses outside, but also the larger ecosystem. And second, I think also that this care, this detail for the people living in it is a very different care, perhaps, than the one that we saw with Mies van der Rohe or something, or in the modernist aesthetic of the early 20th century, where the architecture is quite hard. And people, it's not just that it's made functional for people to live in, this is how people are supposed to be living in those places, right? Which is, as a result, we know that quite a few of those projects failed, or people started doing their own stuff with those buildings and reorganizing them entirely. This is especially, of course, with the Corbusier buildings, the case. And that what I think these metamodern architects is that they put their ear to the ground a bit more. So there is more care also for the individual intimate needs of people. So it isn't more saying you have to live like this. It is more inviting a discussion, a debate. How do you think you should live, right? Which brings me back to the Venice Biennial. How should we live together is posed as a question. And I think that's quite important here in this system. How should we live together? Not one of us will probably have the answer, or actually probably, definitely not one of us will have the answer, but us together might come to some sort of answer to that question.
Hey Wisecrack, Jared here, and today we're exploring the bizarre antics of movie star / performance artist / internet meme Shia LaBeouf.
Do it! Do it! Do it! Just do it! Do it! Do it!
While Shia is perhaps best known for his breakout role in Even Stevens and his later commercial successes, it's been his smaller projects and erratic off-screen antics that have transformed him from a movie star into a kind of meme artist.
When the seagulls follow the trawler, it is because they think sardines will be thrown into the sea. Thank you very much.
Growing up is hard, especially for child actors, and Shia is no exception. His life of fame seems to have left him with very few boundaries and an almost masochistic love of self-mockery. When musician Rob Cantor wanted to shoot a music video for his song about a rampaging cannibal known as Shia LaBeouf, Shia was not only willing to participate, but suggested he reenact the clapping scene from Citizen Kane. Why does Shia have his own entry on KnowYourMeme.com? Is he just another actor like William Shatner or Chuck Norris who's willing to cash in on his fame through self-parody? Or is something else going on here?
I went through like an existential crisis, which turned into some kind of like exploration. Really. I went through like an existential crisis, which turned into some kind of like exploration.
Okay, so this video is a second of a three-part series on episteme. And what I want to do with this video in particular is talk about my affiliation with the metamodern political movement. Because I think it's important to remember that the political coalitions, they kind of exist because there's a common goal among its members, but it's also important that we remember that we act as kind of individual agents from within these movements. The movement kind of remains self-critical and can keep refreshing itself and make sure that it has the right dialogue for the public. So what I'm going to do with this video is talk about, I'm going to frame it in terms of the good and the bad and also what I find ugly about the movement. But of course, we need to start off with the good to even know why spending time on the bad and then some of the ugly aspects are worth reviewing. So if I'm to do that, to talk about the good, I think we start with thinking about the metamodern movement as a reaction to the kind of the cynical and the self-deprecating movement that we saw in the 90s. You know, if we think of even the music that came out of the 90s, like 9 Inch Nails, you know, you had these lyrics, you know, saying, I cut myself today, and then you've got things like Radiohead where they were saying, I'm a creep, and then there was Beck, I'm a loser, you know, why don't you kill me? So, you know, for us growing up in the 90s, this was a very dominating narrative, this very self-critical, self-deprecating, very cynical type of attitude. You know, I think one of the best examples of this aesthetic that the metamodern movement is kind of reacting to is South Park. You know, in South Park, that show was making fun of everybody. There was no one, it was almost kind of the tagline of the movie or the show when people talked about it. There was like no one was safe from being critiqued. Everyone was open for criticism. And if we think of the symptoms that we were living with in the 1990s. You know, we were living in a very large democracy, certainly in the United States, and I think the individual was feeling very small in this massive empire. You know, we were feeling very apathetic to democracy. And we were feeling quite estranged from each other, and we were quite disappointed, you know, that democracy couldn't manifest the voice of the people, and you know, science was supposed to overthrow religious superstition, and we weren't really seeing a lot of the benefits which the modernization of the world was supposed to bring to us. So it's not really a surprise that we saw kind of this aesthetic reaction to all of the promises that were kind of given to us through modernization, which weren't realizing. So this kind of postmodern movement, I think it was a reaction to living with the consequences of this whole process of modernization and building these massive empires and living within these world empires. But I don't think that this postmodern aesthetic that the metamodern movement is reacting to is just kind of some angsty white teenagers, because you can also take the example of the marginalization which kind of overcame the black community or the indigenous people. So I think the postmodern kind of critique of the whole process of modernization was something that was definitely needed. But, you know, after some time of living in this world where you're very cynical and self-critical and very pessimistic and nothing is free from being criticized, you know, you can't live in that aesthetic for very long. After some time, you do want to start making some healthy and kind of romantic and positive and affirmative ways of being in the world. And I think that's what the metamodern movement is now trying to commandeer. They're trying to take over a bit of a more romantic view to life and kind of get back to some of those ideals again of the modern period, get back to that kind of ideal of constructing some healthy worlds for us to live in. But at the same time, take account of that critique, take account of that postmodern critique that we found ourselves in. And for myself, I mean, this metamodern narrative has been very helpful. I mean, it's no lie in these videos. I'm trying to put forward some really, you know, dramatic statements. I'm trying to put forward some real political prescriptions here. And when I do this on the internet, for example, I think the internet is a really good place where we find a lot of this cynicism and this critique and being very cynical and pessimistic. You know, I find a lot of people who aren't digesting these prescriptions very well. So having that metamodern narrative and knowing that we need to, at some point, put some real prescriptions forward, it is very empowering. We need to, at some point, put some real prescriptions forward. It is very empowering.
what is metamodernism? Learning to make important distinctions. And I hope to stress that these are, in fact, important distinctions, that I'm not just shuffling around words here, that we have this vast movement of interconnected things, some of which call themselves metamodern, and others that don't at all or don't even know about the term, but they are somehow connected. So we'll dive into this and give a few different definitions of what metamodernism is. So the first one is to claim it's a cultural phase. So postmodernism has been around in society. I should mention, by the way, this lecture is a little bit less introductory than our former discussions have been, Tom. So this is for a somewhat more advanced audience who might already know a bit about the topic or have some preconceptions. And the first is that it's a cultural phase. So there has been, a lot of ink has been spilled around this topic of postmodernism, the ironic detachment from modern society, the deconstruction of its meaning structures, the critical gaze of humanities and social sciences, discourse analysis, revealing power structures, taking a linguistic turn. Many of these things, feminism is connected to this in many ways, academic feminism anyway, and as are things, of course, within the arts, in the post-colonial theory. There are so many things that are loosely connected to this large structure called postmodernism. And the idea is that after postmodernism, something else has been happening. Something has shifted in culture, in popular culture, in the arts, in academia, in philosophical discourses. So there has been a cultural phase shift. And if we look then at the term metamodernism, that's one of the suggestions for what comes after postmodernism. That it's a cultural phase, a fairly recent one, where the irony of and detachment and critique of the postmodern sentiment has shifted, and you have brought in hope and naivety and progress in a certain sense, albeit all the time oscillating back to this postmodern irony. And this has been observed in the arts and in architecture, even by Vermeulen and van der Akker, to Dutch scholars and cultural theorists who really did a lot to popularize this term and give it new meaning and weight, academically and also culturally speaking. Alison Gibbons is active in that same space, and there's literary scholars like Alexandra Dumitrescu, who has analyzed literature. There are a few books that particularly seem to capture this metamodern essence. So Infinite Jest, of course, is a title that comes up a lot here. It's called a metamodern novel. Greg Dember and Linda Cerello have analyzed popular culture in TV shows and a lot of other things and looked for this new trend, like this new sincerity showing up. Luke Turner is an artist himself, but he wrote Metamodernist Manifesto, a short, poetic, inspiring piece that highlights these topics, that it's an oscillation, that there is informed naivety, that there is magical realism, and so on. So there is a kind of both and thinking then. again, of modernity and its naive belief in progress and the truth, and postmodernity with its skepticism towards these. And it takes many different expressions across culture. And in this sense, it is metamodernism is an alternative to other phases of that cultural theorists and analysts have proposed. Postmodernism is one. We needn't dig into these. Digimodernism is another one. Transmodernism, that one goes a little bit in the direction of being a new philosophy. We'll get back to that perhaps. Performativism also perhaps goes in the direction a little bit more of being a philosophy. But all of these encapsulate that somehow there is something new going on. Internet society has some new cultural dynamics which were not seen earlier and which should be viewed as distinct from what we have learned to recognize as postmodernism in our culture. And that there are more and more of these expressions and certain cultural logics that come with these expressions. Certain cultural logics of how Seth Abramson could be mentioned in this context also. He particularly looks at the cultural logic of the internet age. For instance, how can Donald Trump get away with saying different things than other presidents? Clearly something has shifted in the cultural dynamics of society.
So, you want to know, what's this metamodern business all about?
I had read this Metamodern manifesto.
Some would call what you endorse to not be modernism, but in fact Metamodernism.
A lot of our audience really wanted to hear your commentary on Metamodernism and Hansi Freinat.
Метамодерн — это колебание.
To get at what metamodern means, first you have to get a grasp of what traditional, modern, and postmodern mean. Here's a quick crash course. Traditional refers to ways of living and thinking that were long the norm in human culture. Think the Middle Ages. Here, religion is incredibly important, and pretty much everyone understands the world through the lens of religious stories, of this world and the other world beyond. Most people work the land and live in kingdoms run by monarchs or lords. Things don't change much, and that's seen as a good thing. Everything has its set place in the great chain of being. There's a natural order to things, laid down by God, and one does well to play the role they were born into within that divine hierarchy, while seeking their ultimate heavenly reward in the other world after they die. Eventually, though, the traditional came to be replaced by the modern. Modern refers to a perspective based on the critique of traditional presumptions and articles of faith. Think the scientific and industrial revolutions. Religion and its other world notion here loses its unchallenged authority, as more and more people come to understand the world through scientific and materialist models. Most people work in factories, living in cities run by bureaucratic governments. Things change a lot, at an accelerating speed, and this is seen as a good thing. This is progress. There is no social order of things set down by God, but the possibility of a true meritocracy in which people can change their own lives for the better. One does well then to try and improve their lot in the world in the small span of their single human life. Sorry, no afterlife. Eventually, modern yields to postmodern. Postmodern refers to a perspective based on the critique of modern presumptions in articles of faith. Think the anti-war, civil rights, environmentalist, and social justice movements. Here science loses its unchallenged authority as more and more people come to see other modes of knowledge as equally valid. Most people work service jobs and live in post-industrial urban or suburban centers. There is no one narrative or story for life, only numerous perspectives. That whole progress trope, that was just a modern secular religion. Not coincidentally, it served those in power. In fact, because what counts for merit in the so-called meritocracy is only determined by those with power in the social order, and always at the expense of groups or identities deemed marginal or outsiders to insider values, one does well to dedicate themselves to activism aimed at correcting these power imbalances by seeking a redistribution of power. Got that? The traditional, the modern, the postmodern, each one supplanting the previous. Now, this process can be viewed historically as the movement through different cultural periods, or it can be viewed philosophically as the movement through different epistemas, or ways of knowing. Or it can be viewed developmentally as the movement through higher and higher stages of understanding and cognition. However you interpret it, everyone agrees that these represent a sort of series, a progression of different modes or structures of thought. Okay, so much for the traditional, modern, and postmodern. Now we can finally talk about the metamodern. The metamodern follows after the postmodern. It is then, in broadest terms, a post-postmodern paradigm, and thus a perspective based on the critique of postmodern presumptions and articles of faith. This corrective is accomplished in important ways by reintroducing ideas, sensibilities, and practices from before the postmodern back into the cultural conversation, but, and here's the crucial part, altered now by their interaction and recontextualization through postmodern critique and awareness. In this sense, metamodern refers to a perspective based on a critique of the postmodern and an attempt to reintegrate the perceived merits of previous perspectives, including the postmodern. The metamodern critiques the postmodern for its failures and excesses, while also integrating postmodernism's own genuine and important critiques. Here, postmodern power analysis loses its unchallenged authority as the ultimate interpretive lens, as more and more people come to see the limits of this kind of political discourse. Radical relativism and endless deconstruction yield at last to earnest, vulnerable, and admittedly fraught quests for true human connection and meaning. Driven by the unavoidable proliferation of global crises, a better, more holistic vision for human flourishing is sought. One that integrates the postmodern social critique even as it avoids its pitfalls and impasses. Metamodern culture, or metamodernism, thus brings critical postmodern awareness to naive traditional and modern cultural ideas and forms, not in an effort to denigrate or cancel them, but in a good faith sensibility that attempts to hold them in balance. In this way, elements from the traditional, the modern, and the postmodern all effectively coexist simultaneously.
Metamodernism through an artist's lens. April 6, 2018, jordanwlee.com. My name is Jordan Lee. Many great thinkers of today are proclaiming publicly that the end of postmodernism is here. A cynical worldview submerged in irony doesn't work for us anymore. We can't progress. Throwing a wrench into the machine and raging against it worked for a while to shine a light on the inconsistencies, the brokenness, the inequality, and the desire for a better world that has been cloaked in a surface of feel-good attitude. Modernism was a movement that embraced hope. Older generations had it good, moving forward through life without a hitch. Economically, politically, religiously, and socially, things seemed to be fine. Coming out of the Great Depression, modernism moved us forward and made us fat and happy, yet there was still an emptiness surging beneath the surface. Those who took enough courage to shine a light on this were seen as outcasts, rebels, troublemakers. Yet those are the same prolific minds who brought us into postmodernism. Angst, recognizing the broken systems, the surface of hope only went skin deep. A generation still left hungry for purpose and meaning. Postmodernism comes along and throws a giant wrench into everything we had been doing. The evolution of technology through television and radio and the birth of the internet brought new ideas to the forefront. The sincerity within postmodernism was beginning to shift. Now, over time, the acceptance of this angst-driven, cynical outlook was seen as ironic against the modernist movement, and we moved on. So here we are. We've lived with these notions for quite some time, yet it hasn't served us very well. The masses are filled to the brim of postmodernism. What was once seen as underground, fringe, edge case ideas in art, culture, fashion, and music and entertainment has become the norm. Normal is weird. Normal is being an individual on the broad spectrum, but our individuality and identity with these things on the surface has still left us empty and broken. There's discussion about postmodernism being dead. Listen to some of the greatest minds and thinkers of today, and they all agree that we are at the end of the postmodern outlook, but they have yet to define what's next. We exist in metamodernism. There is a polarity driving us in our own existence. It becomes confusing. It pushes and pulls within. Yet for so long, I haven't been able to make sense of it. I grew up as an angst-driven teen in the Seattle area, skateboarding, playing rock and roll, embracing the idea of postmodernism in my world of teenage politics, art, music, fashion, etc. It made sense at the time. The masses of the world were boring. Hopeful notions still left to question the meaning of it all. The meaning of everything meant nothing, and the nothingness was filled with ideas. The continued movement served to question ideas and notions that were brought through the modernist movements. Yet the questioning of everything still left me empty with no answers, unfulfilled. Until recently, I've been unable to understand or define the things I have seen or experienced for my life. This was it. I either chose hope or go blindly into my existence, pretending it was all wonderful. Or I choose the cynical path of postmodernism and hope it works out for me in the end. It made no sense. Sincerity or irony, pick a side. But there is oscillation within our existence today, back and forth. You can find meaning in the meaningless. You can experience hope and disconnect simultaneously. We are faced with global problems, economic upturns and downturns, the ability to communicate with everyone in the world, yet we still feel lonely. We are technologically advanced more than any other time, yet we long for the quiet simplicity. We struggle with the humanity within ourselves and stay concerned with humanity as a whole, even though ideas of fixing global problems or saving the world seems like a hopeless idea. Hope is hopeless. Irony breeds a spark of truth, back and forth. So I find myself to define these things for so long, making work that is digital only to be taken down and forever forgotten with a moment's notice. Yet the expectation to pour my heart into all of my work determines my paycheck. Nothing matters. Everything matters. I've been exploring these notions within my work for a while, combining the hope and emptiness, the oscillation between life and death, the simultaneous polarity that we experience on every level of our lives today. Local, global, love, loss, life, death, connected, isolation. We experience these things at rapid speed, and the messaging is forcing us to discover the truth somewhere. Truth exists. The truth is found in the feelings between the oscillations. Recognizing what is happening, I find that the truth of all of it exists between the swinging pendulum of emotions. The oscillations we face every day force us into a stalemate. We become paralyzed. Yet, this is where I believe truth exists. That deep feeling of inner peace, that notion that despite this external chaos, there is hope within. Internal, external.
I mean, I think that in the 2000s, from the early 2000s onwards, I was studying history and then philosophy and then a variety of media studies across Holland and the UK, and also visited a number of art galleries and museums, and I started noticing, alongside many others, I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure you're one of them, a set of changes that were quite subtle, sometimes quite radical at other times, that seemed to suggest that all the stuff that I was being taught at that very moment at university, especially stuff around those notions of the end of history or post-structuralism or postmodernism, that those changes seem to suggest that the stuff that I was taught at university was no longer really applicable to the reality around me, right? And so the theories that I would have thought to use to understand cultural phenomena seem to be out of date somehow. And so there was this sense, okay, we need a new kind of vocabulary to make sense of the things that we're seeing. And in the simplest way, what Robin and Niels van Pucke and I, back in London in 2008, I think we started talking about this. I think we called it metamodernism, or we first actually called it judo-modernism, and then we called it, I think, something modernism, and then metamodernism. Was an attempt to name and to find a cohesive framework for some of these developments. And when I say cohesive, of course, it doesn't cover everything. Perhaps it covers very little, right? There's always different kinds of movements and sensibilities emerging. But it was our attempt to come to terms simply with some of the stuff we were seeing. We were seeing in literature, right? Zadie Smith, Foster Wallace, Jennifer Egan. We were seeing it in the arts, the return of all those manifestos that you saw in art spaces, the return of a sense of optimism, of utopianism even. We saw in literature the return of the epic novel. We saw in music, which was Niels' field, loads of queer folk and a focus on communities and on simple instruments. I remember Coco Rosie being a big thing back then. And generally speaking, a return of a kind of romantic, with a big R, romantic sensibility. And so this was an attempt to just give a name and a particular kind of discourse to some of the stuff we were sensing, I guess. Right? That's the simplest explanation. Yeah. I think the observations that we made in 2008 and then slowly, it takes a while for an academic article to get published. So I think we wrote it in 2008 and then it finally got published in 2010 after peer review and everything. But I think those observations we felt in 2017, and I think I still feel today, mostly still stand. There are changes across the arts, and those changes seem to signal and indicate and perhaps celebrate and also warn us of political changes that are running parallel to them, right? And so I think those observations, which pertain to a new sense of urgency, a new sense of hope, a new sense of sincerity, perhaps also a new sense of desperation, and the particular ways in which those sensibilities were affected, right? Which is both a movement of going somewhere else, whilst at the same time having that doubt perhaps that we were all trained to have from a young age, and I think which is very important. It was constantly held in check or held back by that doubt. I think that tension, I think I still see in so many of the phenomena around me, both in terms of the arts and the political culture and politics here with the big P, so the more geopolitical, political, economical sense, they still stand, right? So I'm quite happy still in many ways with some of those observations. I think that they can still be used and applied to contemporary modes.
You've been listening to Distraction Therapy with me, Rob Watson. Find out more at robwatsonmedia.net or follow me on Instagram and Twitter at RobWMedia.